Hello and welcome to Superhero Ethics. Today we're continuing our journey through comic book history with special guest Jessica Plummer. And we're talking about the end of the golden age of comics, the years immediately after World War II, and the coming of the Comics Code Authority, the force that worked as pretty much a censor on comic books and changed comic books then and still continues to have little effects today. And we'll discuss all that and more after a commercial break. But first I just want to add a quick personal note. My partner and I have decided that instead of trying to schedule something when COVID ends, when we have no idea when that will happen, she and I are going to have a small little wedding ceremony on October 10th. I'll let you all know that, just to let you know that in preparation for that, I probably won't be creating any new content in the week leading up to that or the week after. So those first 2 weeks in October, there will probably not be any content, but once that ends, I'll be right back giving you more content on Superhero Ethics, Star Wars Universe Podcast, and all the great other parts of the Stranded Panda Podcast Network that I'm able to be a co-creator on. So with that, thank you so much, and here's that commercial message. Hello, I'm Matthew. I'm your host. I am joined today by Jessica Plummer, who's been a frequent guest on the show for a lot of topics, but every time we have you on, Jessica, we always sort of get just glimpses of your comic book history knowledge. Something that Jessica writes about quite a lot on bookriot.com. And so now we're continuing this series on the history of comic books. I'm really excited to have you back for it. Jess, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So let's just set the idea of what we're talking about today. Today, and you know this better than I do, so make sure I get this right. Today we're talking about the years after World War II, the sort of second half of the Golden Age, from 1946 to about 1955. And this is the period when comics start changing, and then in response to that, or in response to many social things, a real pushback against comics emerges, and a real push to censor comic books emerges, which leads to the self-censorship of comics by the CCA, the Comics Code Authority. Do I have that right about in terms of like what's the time scale and the major events we're talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to be talking a little bit about, you know, it's very hard to place an exact time frame around things. So we'll be talking a little bit about, you know, stuff that happened during the war and even before the war, and the knockdown effects of the CCA,
right,
as it, you know, flows into the 50s and 60s. But yeah, the comic book industry started to change really significantly after the war, and the Comics Code was put into effect in 1954. So that pretty much covers the time frame you laid out.
Yeah. So and let's just kind of start by catching up a bit. Last time we talked about the beginning of the golden age of comics, the start of Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman, and sort of how this whole comic book thing got started, and especially the Jewish origins of it and some of the social justice origins of it. What are kind of one or two last things that maybe we didn't kind of, that you want to just kind of touch on briefly from that period, or new characters you wanted to make sure we knew about that are going to be important for us as we go forward?
I mean, I think one of the key things about the early Golden Age, or, I mean, when people say the Golden Age, they really do mean the World War II era. The time period that we're talking about now is sort of technically it's part of the Golden Age, but it's just sort of like a middle, like, time that nobody's really that invested in, except when talking about this sort of, nobody's that invested in terms of superheroes, because it wasn't a very active time for superhero stuff.
Right.
But that early period, it was really sort of, it was very anything goes. It was a completely new medium. Superheroes were a completely new concept. I mean, they had been, you know, they took their inspiration from earlier characters, but they were a really new idea. And so it was a very creative sort of free-for-all in the industry, and people were just throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what stuck. The ideas of, like, trademark and plagiarism were also still being worked out, like what it does and does not constitute plagiarism, which we talked about a bit in the previous episode in this series with the Captain Marvel lawsuit. But, like, you know, creators were stealing from each other willy-nilly, and I mean, everybody was just sort of, like, having fun doing whatever they felt like doing, because it was cheap pulp entertainment that cost 10 cents, and nobody was looking at it that closely until all of a sudden they were, which I think, you know, is very relevant to what we're going to talk about today.
Right. And so one last thing I just wanted to tease out from that time. I know that you are just a little bit of a fan of Oliver Queen, the Green Arrow. And because that character is going to come up a lot as we go forward, why don't you tell us a little bit about his origins?
I love him. I love him so much. Yeah, he is also a Golden Age character. He debuted in 1941. It was created by Mort Weisinger and George Papp. And the funny thing about him is that basically, so Mort Weisinger was the editor of the Superman titles for like a billion years. Like the heart of the Silver Age where Superman absolutely dominated the newsstands. And he had created Green Arrow and he liked him. So Green Arrow and his sidekick Speedy are in like every single issue of a couple of Superman books. Adventure Comics and World's Finest Comics were both like anthology books with Superman as the lead character, or in the case of World's Finest Comics, Superman and Batman as like a team up. And then there'd be all these backup stories, and Green Arrow and Speedy are in all of these backup stories from the early 40s to like 1969, which I know because I've been reading through those appearances because that's how much I love these characters. But the thing that's interesting about the interesting effect of that is that we'll talk about this more in our next episode, but a lot of DC characters went through this major upheaval in the late 50s and early 60s because they had kind of disappeared during the time period we'll be talking about this episode, and they were very much revitalized when superheroes became popular again in the beginning of the Silver Age. But because Green Arrow had just sort of been like, you know, riding along on Superman's coattails or cape tails or whatever for decades, he really hadn't changed, and so he doesn't get a significant makeover until 1970, and that's when we really start to see the modern character, and that's actually considered by many people to be sort of the date that they pin the start of the Bronze Age to, because like the revitalization of the Flash, Barry Allen was a new character at this point in 1956 as it started the Silver Age, and the makeover of Green Arrow and his team up with Green Lantern for all these like social justice stories in 1970 is the start of the Bronze Age.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. That totally makes sense. And for a lot of people, actually, first let me ask this a short question. So, was Oliver Queen and Arrow appearing in the same story and in the same world as Superman, or was it just that it would be like 5 pages at the end of a Superman book would be this totally different story starring Oliver Queen and Speedy?
Yeah, it's a totally different story. It took a while for DC to create sort of a unified universe. So I mentioned that World's Finest was a team-up book for Superman and Batman. Originally, it actually wasn't. It was a book that starred Superman and Batman, but they were in separate stories. So you'd open the book and there'd be a Superman story, and then there'd be a bunch of other stuff. Okay. Yeah, there'd be a bunch of other stuff in the middle to kind of keep you reading, and then at the end there'd be a Batman and Robin story. And then you get like Johnny Quick in there and Aquaman. And right. I did not realize Johnny Quick had so many appearances. I mean, I like the guy.
I've heard the character before.
He's like the Flash, except he recites a mathematical formula to help him go fast.
Oh, okay. That sounds plausible.
I mean, it's science.
Well, and so for those of us, go ahead.
Well, so then eventually they actually put Batman and Superman in a story together. And then once the idea of the Justice Society of America, which is like the precursor to the Justice League, when the Justice Society debuted, that was pretty firmly establishing, like, yes, all of these characters exist in the same universe. But Ollie didn't really interact with other members of the Justice, or other superheroes, until the early 60s when he joined the Justice League, and then Speedy joined the Teen Titans in the late 60s.
Got it. And just briefly, for those of us who, like myself, I know about Oliver Queen because of the CW Berlantiverse. How much does that character, and obviously that's a very brooding, very teen romance, new breakups every episode kind of world. And don't get me wrong, I love the Arrow universe. But for those of us who mostly know Arrow through that, what is this? What is the Arrow that emerges at this point in the mid-40s? How is that different?
Oh, he's super generic. I mean, I would say that the version on the show, he's kind of a Batman light. Like, the creators have said they wanted to do a Batman show and they couldn't get permission, so they just did a Green Arrow show. And I mean, I've always, like, if I have to explain who Green Arrow is to people, I say he's Batman meets Robin Hood. Like, that's the basic idea. But in these early stories, when I say he's Batman meets Robin Hood, he is not Batman, the brooding, tormented, tragic figure. He's like Batman, not quite the Adam West version yet, because this predates that, but like a very, affable, approachable, like fully deputized,
bouncy and happy without quite being campy.
Exactly. But he's got arrows instead of things in his utility belt.
So a lot you failed this city is not quite showing up in the 40s yet?
Oh, that's a coinage of the show. He never said that in the comics until the show came along.
Nice.
He's much more, like, when he does develop an actual personality, it's much more like if you've got, like, a really liberal uncle who gets drunk at family events and then just starts yelling about Republicans. That's Oliver Queen, and that's why I love him.
I really want my sister to have children so I can be that uncle. That's pretty much my life ambition.
You do have to grow a funny beard, though.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of on the way there. But yeah, that does make sense. And I know in the TV show, we see some elements of that, of the, like, I have lots of money, but I'm questioning the whole world of people with money and that kind of stuff. So it's nice to know that does have some origins in the comic book character, even if that comes rather later. So let's now shift into what is, I think, kind of the main event for this period of time, the CCA. And in studying this somewhat, obviously it seems like you got to go on a real journey to go from the kind of patriotic superheroes we were talking about last episode to a point where middle America is so afraid of comic books that that people are literally, and we'll talk about these details, but people are dancing around fires. Kids are throwing comic books into the fires, and people are talking about this as the biggest menace to their children. So let's talk about the late 40s and how do we get there? What happens to comic books after World War II?
Well, so comic books continued to be very, very successful, and they sold very, very well. I'm going to be mentioning this book a lot while we talk about this. The 10-Cent Plague, The Great Comic Book Scare and How It Changed America by David Hoggedu. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it's basically talking about exactly what we're talking about. It's excellent. I'm just looking at some numbers that he gives right at the beginning of the book. And this is a little bit later than when you're talking about. But he says, comics were selling in the mid-40s, comics were selling between 80 million and 100 million copies every week, with a typical issue passed along or traded to 6 to 10 readers, thereby reaching more people than movies, television, radio, or magazines for adults. By 1952, more than 20 publishers were producing nearly 650 comics titles per month, employing well over 1,000 artists, writers, editors, letterers, and others, among them women such as Janice Value, who's a woman that he's interviewing at the beginning of this, as well as untold members of racial, ethnic, and social minorities who turned to comics because they thought of themselves or their ideas as unwelcome in more reputable spheres of publishing and entertainment. So comics, the comic book industry as a whole was doing great. They were selling like hotcakes. Everybody, most children were reading them. Again, we talked last time about, and something like 97% of boys and 92% of girls read comics or something like that. I saw a contemporary statistic when I was flipping through the 10-Cent Plague earlier today that said 9 in 10 households had comics in them. Really. Sorry, go ahead.
I did just some anecdotal kind of research on this and talked to a lot of my family members because my father and his siblings and a lot of their cousins and things like that were born in the early 40s. And so this is when they were kids. And I was amazed. I mean, these were people who were not geeks. They would never think of looking at science fiction. They were pretty mainstream, like Jewish New York kids. And they all read comic books. And they all had very positive memories of comic books. And it's funny because today, we're just a couple days away from a TV show based on a comic book, Watchmen, winning major Emmy Awards for Best Writing and Best Acting. And there's a sort of feeling of like, oh my God, comic books are finally going mainstream. And so I think it's really powerful to remember, like, no, this isn't, like they're going mainstream again. Back then, they really were a mainstream. This wasn't the two weird kids in your high school who no one talked to. They read comic books, and I say that as being that weird kid. But yeah, it's interesting to see like how different that is from our perception of it today.
Yeah, and I mean, when you think about it, if we're talking about the late 40s, very few households had a television at that point. And the other thing about entertainment at the time is, and I'm oversimplifying a bit, but my understanding is that the bulk of it was, what today we call 4-quadrant entertainment, which is basically, it appeals to men, women, boys, and girls. Those are the 4 quadrants, right?
Okay.
You didn't have targeted media.
Right.
So, because if a household had a television, then your parents decided what you watched. If you didn't have a television, you definitely had a radio. Your parents decided what you listened to. If you go to the movies are not really at that point so much made for segmented audiences. I mean, they definitely have genres, but they're not really, nobody's saying this movie is for women ages 18 to 35 the way that they might now.
Right. There's no the demographics. I mean, no one cares what people of color are thinking about or what like college educated or non-college educated. It's just people. By which I mean the default of like white middle class.
I would say there was definitely like a segment of the film industry that catered to Black people and had Black actors. And I don't know the details, but I'm sure that existed for radio as well. So a little bit of demographic segmenting by race, but certainly not for, that I know of, for other ethnic groups. I mean, there were like Yiddish newspapers and stuff. Well, anyway, right. The point is, if you're a kid, there's very little media that's just for you. But comic books are for you. And that sort of anarchic quality to them that was created by it being a brand new industry really appealed to children. And so they were just devouring them. And then there was increased readership because comics were being sent, during the war, comics were being sent to the GIs as like a little, memento of home. I mean, these are very young men. If you're 18 and it's not that long since you started reading or stopped reading comics maybe, and it's nice to see Captain Marvel again or whoever.
Yeah, I can see that.
And so it expanded the readership into that sort of young adult market. And when I say young adult, I mean adults who are young and not teenagers like we mean today.
Right.
But yeah, so comics were selling very well, but not superheroes necessarily. Superman continued to sell well. Batman and Wonder Woman did fine. Captain Marvel was doing great until DC really tied Fawcett Comics' hands up with the lawsuit and they couldn't really publish anymore. Other publishers had other characters that they were publishing. Timely, which would become Marvel, still had Captain America and Namor the Submariner and the original Human Torch and a few others. But that genre was not a super popular genre after the war. And I'm not really sure why. I don't know if it was, because the idea of a miraculous hero who could save us from the bad thing didn't feel as necessary once the war was over.
The U.S. Army had just done that.
Yeah, and we do see a turn towards sort of atomic-based fears, but not quite yet. Not really at this point.
But we do start seeing the comics turning darker, right? Isn't this when like a lot of more the horror comics and kind of more the lurid comics and those kind of things start to develop?
Yeah, exactly. So the genres that start to emerge here, I mean, there are a lot of different genres. Like, you also see Westerns becoming popular at this point, and actually war comics. Romance comics became a thing. This is really, I was looking at, like, comics debuts by year during the period that we're discussing, and Archie Comics started putting out a lot more books. So these characters weren't new, but all of a sudden Jughead had his own comic, and Betty and Veronica had a comic, and you could see like the company is doing very well because they're able to release more and more books with these kinds of characters.
And that's what I was going to ask. When you say romance comics, do you mean something like Archie, where it's like high school hijinks and mostly like who's going to take who to the prom and that kind of thing?
No, those are generally considered like teen humor comics. Romance comics are hilarious and amazing. They're these really soapy, like, I'm trying to think of good examples. It's like, they're all from the point of view of a young woman who's like desperately in love with some guy, and he doesn't notice her, and then she goes to a dance and she's pretty and he does, and he gets married. Or whatever, or like she's in a love triangle. Like, they're very, very soapy, over the top. I mean, they're great. I say this with all like love and respect. But it's stuff like, I feel like I read one once where the heroine was like a military nurse, and she fell in love with a GI who'd been blinded by a bomb or something, and she was afraid that when his vision came back he would think she was ugly. I'm sure she like wore glasses or had freckles or some fake ugly thing. Yeah. But then he still loved her and they got married. Like, that kind of thing. It's not humor.
And we're not talking about bodice ripper lurid romance novel stuff. We're talking about very chaste romance stories, right?
Yeah, this was all really chaste stuff. This was aimed at girls. So I think the idea that young women, or really, I guess, teenage girls would be I'm not even sure what the target age was, but I think the idea that, like, girls of the target audience would have sexual desires or be interested in sexual content was just, like, it was beyond their conception. If you see something sexy in a comic from this era, it's not Wonder Woman, it's for boys.
Right. This is the like Prince Charming Cinderella understanding of romance. This is not yet the anything sexual or anything like that. That makes sense.
No, it's a very chaste sort of the idea is for the reader to be able to put herself into that story.
So what were the things that were freaking people out that led to this big pushback against the 10-cent plague? So
the big genres, the ones that you alluded to that were getting especially popular, were crime and horror. So these were published by all sorts of publishers, but EC Comics is particularly famous for them. And they were really very lurid, often quite nihilistic. So it wasn't like, when we think of a crime story now, I think we're thinking more of a detective story or a procedural. And so even though it can be very dark, like, you watch any police procedural on TV and it starts with a, raped woman's body found in a dumpster and it goes from there. Right. These were often just like, somebody, like a bank robber decides to double cross his friends after they rob this bank. And so he tries to, and they all kill each other. And that's the end of the story. Like, there weren't...
Reservoir Dogs, the cart. Basically, it's Quentin Tarantino writing comic books at this point in time.
Yeah, a little bit. Like, they weren't edifying in any way. And I'm not, like, I say that without any, that's a value neutral statement. I don't necessarily think comics need to be edifying. But they weren't. It was often like, a monster eats a pretty girl. Because the artist wanted to draw a pretty girl and had to draw a monster.
And you start to see that seep into the superheroes? Like, does Batman start dealing with gangsters who are all killing each other? Or is Superman fighting the monsters that are eating pretty girls? Or is this all kept kind of outside of the superhero stories?
No, this is really for those particular genres.
Right.
The one thing it depends on the publisher, you do see a little bit more of is sex. So not really. I can't think of many examples, if any, from what would become DC or Marvel. I mean, Catwoman was slinking around, but I don't think she got significantly sexier in the late 40s than she had been in the early 40s.
We don't see Lois Lane all of a sudden having her clothing ripped by whatever terrible thing she's in, or that kind of.
Oh no, Lois stayed pretty much the same during this era. If you look at, for example, I sent you this cover before we started talking, but if you look at Phantom Lady covers from the time, so she was published by Quality Comics. She has this very, very skimpy outfit that's like 2 little flaps of cloth over her breasts and then like hot pants, and they're kind of connected in the middle. Those covers got very, very cheesecakey.
And in that one, she's holding a piece of rope where like there's no like lasso of truthness. This is purely just a like, come tie me up, sir.
Oh, absolutely. I've read a lot of Blue Beetle comics from this period too, and Blue Beetle was published by Fox Comics at the time, and Fox was always a leader in how sleazy can we be. So yeah, a lot of these covers have very like not Phantom Lady in her skimpy outfit, but like a similarly very, very cheesecakey lady, very curvaceous, being tied up or terrorized, and her clothing is torn, and like gangsters are menacing her with knives. And then like maybe you see Blue Beetle like peeking in a window like he's gonna come and rescue her, but like maybe he'll stop and watch for a bit first. Like these are very, they're pretty funny, honestly.
Yeah.
And they're sexy. They're like, if you look at the other media that was coming out during the late 40s, like this is not what you would expect. And I am often surprised by how saucy some of these covers can get.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And so it's interesting. So this is kind of what leads to this big pushback against comics overall, and that we'll get to in specific in a minute. But so am I right in saying that like one of the things that most impacted the superhero comic book history, this period of censorship and the Comics Code, really had nothing to do with comic book. That superheroes were kind of the collateral damage here, because it was mostly a fight against non-superhero comic books. Is that kind of a fair statement?
I mean, yes and no. I would say, I mean, I think, you know, to unpack that a little bit more, we'll have to get into Frederick Wortham himself and his actual sort of accusations about comics.
Let's do that then. Let's talk about what actually happens and how we get to the CCA, and then we can talk about who's getting hit by it. So tell us a little bit, good Mr. Wortham.
So, Dr. Wortham, I think you mean.
Dr. Wortham, sorry.
So first, I do want to point out that Frederick Wortham, who is the most infamous critic of comics as being bad for children, but he was certainly not the first. Again, flipping through the 10-Cent Plague, I saw that he had pointed out that as early as 1909, parents were writing to the newspapers and telling Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst that their comic strips were bad for children. And this was well before comic books were a thing. And I think it's just a thing that happens in media. So like when you and I were kids, rap and heavy metal and video games were getting this kind of treatment. And I
think I'm a little older than you. With my generation, it was Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, teaching Satanism.
The satanic rituals of rolling 12-sided dice.
And, 200 years ago? That number's probably wrong. But novels. Novels were supposed to be bad for young women. So I think any kind of popular entertainment that especially becomes popular with either children in general or girls and young women in particular is going to get a lot of attention from I'll be generous and say well-meaning adults who want to make sure that their children are not obsessed with a thing that is bad for them. And, you know, in the case of comic books, they had been popular throughout the war, but I think the grown-ups had other stuff to worry about. So it was after the war, part of what it was that in order to capture those readers who were not so into superheroes, the crime and horror stuff got more lurid, but it was also because parents had stuff to worry about now, or had room to worry about things that weren't, you know, my son is fighting in the Pacific and might die.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this is, I know when you and I talked, I had sort of asked about if this is all connected directly to McCarthyism and that kind of thing. And from what you said and some of the research I did, it sounds like not really. Like no one was ever thinking like this was communist influence or that kind of thing. But it goes to, you know, the McCarthyist Red Scare and the fears about Martin Luther King and all these things. There was this sort of general aura of we have to protect our culture from all of these terrible influences. You know, our children can't become communist. They can't listen to black people music. They can't read comic books. It seems like it's all... There's a general sort of cultural idea of we have to protect the innocence of American youth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I said I didn't really think that it had a lot to do with communism. And I think it didn't specifically, because we were talking about whether the fact that so many of the creators were Jewish was connected to that. And many people didn't know the names of the creators because they weren't credited in the books themselves. Right. And I feel like a lot of these parents, even if the names had been in the book, would not have bothered to look, because these were not people who were actually reading the comics that they were upset about. Like, right. Ever, really. I
mean, no censor ever has. I mean, that's kind of the way censorship works. But yes, understood.
But just, again, flipping through the 10-Cent Plague, he talks about comics being accused of being both communist and fascist. Oh yeah, they're everything you don't like. They're everything that's bad for America and could hurt your kids.
Okay.
There is a certain amount of, you know, if you can pick up on the subtext of it, comics, and not just superhero comics, really did reflect the immigrant experience and the second generation experience. Right. And they were urban. They mostly came out of New York City. If you thought that was the place where virtue went to die, you weren't going to want your kids reading comics. I mean, I am currently living in an anarchist zone or something.
Yeah, no, that's true.
So,
and I think that's an interesting point where, I think a lot of the times when people critique stuff coming out of New York City and like cultural elites ruining our children and that kind of stuff, there's often a lot of coded anti-Semitism in those arguments. And I think it's kind of ironic, but not at all surprising, that you might have had these arguments that were kind of laced with a little bit of like, you know, these things aren't good American values and that kind of like hidden anti-Semitism type things, without ever realizing that most of the authors are Jewish. That seems the exact kind of irony we get in this a lot.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Frederick Wertham himself. So he writes this tract called Seduction of the Innocent. And
the baller title.
This is clearly a, you know, well laid out, logical, reasonable, show both sides kind of approach to the comic book idea, right? Or am I missing something?
No, not so much. So Wertham was a psychiatrist, and like, I will give him his due. He was not a monster. He really was genuinely concerned about the youth of America, and I was reading up on him, and he actually was like a huge ally for Black people at the time, and he like campaigned for desegregation of the army during World War II, and he was friends with Ralph Ellison, and like,
oh wow,
yeah, like, again, not all bad. And like, part of the reason that he became sort of so fixated on comic books was because he was working with children. He was working with, you know, what were then classified as quote unquote disturbed children, but disadvantaged children, kids with mental health problems. And he was trying to figure out why was this happening? But of course, then his methodology, like one of the big things that he kind of threw out the window was the principle that correlation is not causation. So he, would talk to 10 kids who were like in an institution and say, do you all read comics? And they'd say yes, because all the kids read comics. It wasn't these kids in the institution read comics and that's why they were in an institution. It was like saying, do you breathe oxygen? Like, yeah. Right. I'm a kid in 1946. What do you think?
Yeah. And it makes sense. It makes sense, especially because, like, we're starting to get into the 50s. We're starting to get into some of the, like, post-war existential, like, nihilism that starts to pop up a lot and leads to the Beat generation to a large extent. And so I can imagine that there's a lot of forces being like, we don't want to actually look inward. We don't want to ask, could there be anything wrong with this? The American century is just dawning. Everything about America is supposed to be perfect. We just freed the world. And so when you don't want to look at the idea of like angst within the youth, it has to be like, oh, okay, no, it's because of these comic books. These books are taking the pure and innocent and making them bad. There's certainly nothing inherent in our own culture that would do this.
Absolutely. And this was also when terms like teenager and juvenile delinquent started to be in use, and juvenile delinquency was considered a huge problem. And, to be fair, you did have a lot of young people coming out of the war years or returning from war and not really knowing what to do with themselves. Yeah. I don't think young people at the time were any worse or better than young people have ever been. I think people are people. And, if you go back to like ancient Roman writings, you'll see people complaining that teenagers don't listen to their elders. Yeah. So it's not a new thing. The biology of
what hormones do to you when you hit puberty that's not tied to a society. That's just, chemicals.
Exactly. But it was a buzzword. Sort of the way that Satanist was, back in the 80s. And Wortham's central thesis was that comic books cause juvenile delinquency. And again, he had these very non-scientific studies where it's unclear how much he was deliberately fudging things to get to the result he wanted and how much he was so caught up in what he thought was happening that he didn't realize that he was fudging things. But he would do things like he listed out, again, he was working with these kids who were in this institution for children with mental health problems. I think it was basically, it was juvie. And right. He said he listed all these terrible things they were doing to each other. They were choking each other. They were, a bunch of kids held a boy down and stabbed him in the arm with a pencil because they wanted to. Like, all this whole list of different like vicious things that children do to each other, that children have always done to each other. And he said it was because of comics. And I think it was like in one case, a kid had been reading a comic that depicted a similar scenario, but like the kid never said, I am doing this because I saw it in the comic. And it was the only instance where there was even a case where what happened in real life matched what was shown in the comic. And all the other ones, there was no parallel to anything happening in a comic book. But he said, all of these terrible things these children did to each other are because they got the idea from comics, which is just, like, obviously not true. Like, that's not what happened there. And there were all these stories circulating at the time, not just from Wortham, but, like, were in the news and stuff, about kids who, they saw, there was one story, I mean, these are terrible stories. There was one story about a little boy who, hanged himself, and, there was a comic book, like, on his, he basically put a noose over his bed and hanged himself, and when they found him, there was a comic on his bed that depicted someone being hanged, and the coroner determined that he was like playing. He was trying to figure out if he could do what they were doing, and he slipped. And there are stories of kids jumping off the roof because they thought they could fly like Superman. There's one story about these two brothers who got into a fight over a comic book. They were fighting over who got to read it, and so one of them took his dad's gun and shot the other one. Oof.
And like it seems like we're always going to have horror stories like that, but that there's this real tendency, maybe it's in other cultures as well, but especially in American culture, to say, you know, we can't actually think that there's anything fundamentally wrong with our culture that's causing this, and so it must be these outside influences. This is what I was talking about before. What it makes me think of, honestly, is when the Columbine shooting happened back in the late 90s. You know, these were two very troubled young men. They had been radicalized in a lot of ways. They had been, you know, there was a whole lot of discussions that could have been had about were they radicalized, or were they the victims of bullying and like high school class structures and stuff, or like what the causes were. But instead, it mostly became about, you know, goth culture. And like me and my friends who were hardcore goths at the time basically like wouldn't be let into stores because we were wearing long dark coats because that's what they were from. You know, and it's just and I remember it was a time where I was like, you know, let's actually talk about whatever issues drove them to this. Because I think that's one of the things that will happen a lot. It sounds like this is very much what happened here. Is you're always going to have I don't want this to be the case, but you're always going to have emotionally troubled kids who do things that emotionally troubled kids do. And we should work as a society to reduce that and to deal with it. But it seems like in every generation, there's some cause that people want to say, well, the two most extreme people who were comic book fans did these terrible things, so let's assume that comic books caused that, and thus, you know, in the same way that people don't say, like, look at all the many people who play violent video games and don't go commit shootings, you know? It's as you said, correlation doesn't mean causation.
Yeah, I mean, again, if every kid in America is reading comics and 0.00001% of them commit violent acts, I don't think that is proof that comics lead to violent acts. Just same with video games. Same with no, you're exactly right. And I was a freshman in high school when Columbine happened, and all of a sudden we weren't allowed to wear trench coats to school. Not that anybody was wearing a trench coat to school, because it's a weird thing to wear.
Hey,
we didn't have goths in my school. We had like one goth. She was very lonely.
That's fair. I think you were not a high schooler when Trent Reznor came about, so we had very different experiences in that regard.
Oh no, my high school football team ran out onto the field to the Backstreet Boys' "Larger Than Life." We were extremely wholesome.
Oh wow. Okay. Yep. We went to very different schools. But yeah, and just to give people an idea of just how it's funny because you know, Wortham is so upset about the luridness of comics, and that's exactly the word I was about to use to describe his language, that he uses this very lurid purple prose. To give an example, like, of one of the things he says is, and I quote, "I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry." Like, he's not pulling any punches. He's not saying, you know, here's one. He is saying, like, this is a complete social evil straight from the bowels of hell. One thing I looked at somewhat is where some other folks went. And one thing I saw was that a lot of the hate about it was driven by churches and like church youth groups. And especially there in more conservative ones, there was, you know, because this is the beginning of like the Billy Graham era and like, you know, faith revivals and stuff. And there was a lot of, you know, this is the work of the devil. You know, these are the devil's tools. This is the devil at work. We have to destroy all this to destroy Satan. Like, I mean, people were really fired up about the hate of this.
Yeah. I think Wortham might be the first person to run afoul of Godwin's Law. Yeah. Like, oh boy, you just lived through it, so I feel like you should know that you are overstating things, but okay. A lot of religious groups, a lot of church groups specifically, were very anti-comics, especially, not only, but especially Catholics. And this has historical precedent because about 10 or 15 years prior, Catholics in particular, Catholic organizations, I should say, not just like my grandparents, but Catholic organizations in particular were very much behind the pushback against the movies for very similar issues of sex and violence and were instrumental in getting the Hays Code, or colloquially referred to as the Hays Code, the Motion Picture Production Code, put into effect in 1934, which, forbade the kind of violent gangster movies that had been super popular, and nudity, and you couldn't say the word pregnant, and blah blah blah.
Wow.
This was the comic book industry underwent basically exactly the same thing, just a little bit later. But yeah, again, it was very much driven by church groups and especially Catholic organizations.
And that makes a lot of sense, especially when you remember that a lot of those same groups were very much behind McCarthyism. And it's not coincidence that he comes out of very Catholic Wisconsin. I'm pretty sure he was himself Catholic. And a lot of there's a huge Catholic church movement that was supporting him, to be sure. So let's start talking about, so what happens? So he brings up all this hate of comic books, and there's a lot of local laws that start getting passed or threaten to get passed, banning comic books, or, as I said, there was a whole bunch of burnings of comic books, which I always thought is kind of funny because you have to pay for the thing in order to burn it. So, if you told me I'm going to write a book and 10 million people are going to buy copies of it to burn it, cool, I just sold 10 million copies. I'm good.
Yeah, didn't this happen kind of recently with Nike? People were buying Nikes to burn.
So
okay.
good.
And Nikes cost a lot more than a comic book, even today.
Yeah. But anyway, so what does the comic book industry start to do, and how does this lead to the CCA?
Well, so to back up a little bit, because we touched on, you did ask about superheroes, and we touched on, all the crimes and horror comics and the sexual content that there was pushback against. There was also, Wortham did have some accusations to level against superheroes, primarily the superheroes from national publications, which would become DC. He thought Superman was a fascist, which I have seen some movies in the past decade that would make me potentially agree with that one. It makes me sad. He very famously accused Batman and Robin of being gay, and specifically being lovers, which nowadays is generally when people talk about seduction of the innocent, they're like, oh, the Batman and Robin are gay thing, which I think is a really interesting accusation, because so I read this book many, at least 15 years ago, but there's a book called Batman Unmasked by Will Brooker, which points out that he didn't really invent this idea, but he interviewed gay men who said, yeah, they're gay. Batman and Robin are gay, and he was like, oh no. And again, his methods are not great here, because he, would conflate what different men said to him, or he was like, I found more than one guy, and it was like, yeah, because you talked to a couple together at the same time.
And this is fascinating to me as well, because I feel like if you want to go after the lowest of low-hanging fruit in terms of is there too much gayness in comic books, Wonder Woman hanging around on the Isle of Lesbos, or what is it,
It's Paradise Island, but no, he did call her a lesbian. Oh, he absolutely went for that one.
It's they keep saying out, great Sappho.
There's
there's really strong lesbian imagery.
Suffering Sappho.
Down to the Themyscira pillow fight kind of cheesecake stuff that comes out a lot. So it's just funny to me that they focus more on Batman. But yeah, if they talk about Wonder Woman too, that makes sense.
Oh yeah, no, I think that is, I haven't read Seduction of the Innocent itself. I think that our culture today focuses more on Batman, the accusations against Batman over the accusations against Wonder Woman, because our culture cares more about men. Yeah. I think that's why the Wonder Woman stuff kind of gets blown off. But yeah, he also was like, oh, Wonder Woman's a lesbian, which is like, yeah, kind of. I mean, she's bi, but yeah, you're not wrong, dude. And also, Marston wasn't going to be like, no, there's no sex in these comics, because there clearly was.
Right.
So there was so much obvious subtext.
Well, and I guess that's one of my first questions is, so as this hate is starting to brew, it seems like Marston and Wonder Woman are very intentionally trying to do something about sexuality and gender in ways that Superman and Batman very much are not. Like, no one's trying to tell a story about, gender ideas of love with Batman and Robin the way Marston is. Is there pushback against Martin specific? Like, as the comic book industry starts to realize there's a problem, is Marston and Wonder Woman singled out a little bit? Like, kind of like, look, you got to shut up. You're getting us all in trouble.
Not that I know of. Certainly as we get into the 50s, Wonder Woman comics, it's those early comics that are so weird and so kinky and so much fun. And they get very, very toned down. And Wonder Woman herself gets sort of desaturated a bit, more marriage focused. It's a bummer. But you start to see more of that emphasis on like heterosexual pairings. In the late 50s, DC, or mid to late, I'm not sure of the exact year, but DC introduces Batwoman, and the first Batgirl with a hyphen, into Batman comics to throw some love interests at Batman and Robin. But the problem is, at the time, comics were also, particularly comics that were specifically aimed at boys, were very sexist and basically written for an assumed audience of little boys who thought that girls had cooties. So what winds up happening is you get female characters like Batwoman and Batgirl being introduced and throwing themselves at Batman and Robin. There's a minor Green Arrow character like this. It's how Lois Lane behaves. And then the male superheroes desperately trying to avoid it and just having like total disinterest and disdain for these female characters. And it's like, you made it more gay.
It reminds me of how the creators of Scooby-Doo, when people were concerned that there might have been like too much sexuality among the Scooby Gang, basically wrote that, Ginger and Velma, and is Ginger? What's
Daphne.
Daphne and Velma and Fred and Shaggy are basically each living like little domestically perfect lives in their own houses, and it comes off as such like domestic partnership gayness. Like, great.
Yeah, pretty much.
But so pulling us back to this. So okay, so what's the comic book industry doing in response, and how does this lead to the CCA?
Well, so it's less at this point what the comic book industry is doing and more what parents are doing and what consumers are doing. I am going to take the liberty of reading another quote from the book. Churches and community groups raged and organized campaigns against comic books. Young people acted out mock trials of comics characters. Schools held public burnings of comics, and students threw thousands of the books into the bonfires. At more than one conflagration, children marched around the flames reciting incantations denouncing comics. The offices... I
just want to say, students dancing around flames, uttering incantations because we have to stop Satanism. Go on.
It's just like how if you introduce a girl that Batman and Robin don't like at all, it will make them seem straighter. The offices of one of the most adventurous and scandalous publishers, EC Comics, were raided by the New York City police. Jesus. More than 100 acts of legislation were introduced on the state and municipal levels to ban or limit the sale of comics. Soon, Congress took action with a set of sensational televised hearings that nearly destroyed the comic book business. The majority of working comics artists, writers, and editors, more than 800 people, lost their jobs. A great many of them would never be published again. Through the near death of comic books and the end of many of their makers' creative lives, post-war popular culture was born.
Right.
Which is just wild.
Mm-hmm,
and
sure.
there are anecdotes in this book about these burnings, because what would happen was like the town council would be like, oh no, comics are bad, and then they'd be like, okay, you can't sell crime comics anymore, you can't sell like, and when I say crime comics, I mean, like, that's the title of the comic. Or there was one called Crime Suspense Stories, which I don't know how to pronounce because suspense stories is one word. Okay, you can't sell that one anymore. Like, Archie is okay. Picture stories from the Bible is okay. Maybe... So
they're at least drawing some distinctions. Like, no one was ever burning Archie comics?
No. I mean, Archie literally has done Bible comics. Like, they aren't published by Archie Comics, but they, like, license them out to a different publisher that, like, tells Bible stories, and it's just, like, the Archie characters being like, I love the Bible. So,
that's hilarious.
Yeah. It's only in, like, the past decade that Archie's gotten a little scandalous. But, yeah, basically, different municipalities would ban specific comics, or they would say, like, we ban any comic that's injurious to our children, which is like, okay, who defines that? And it wasn't just like small towns in the middle of nowhere. Like, this was happening in New York and LA, Chicago, and it was controversial. Like, the Chicago banned some comics, and the Chicago Tribune wrote this blistering editorial that was like, you haven't actually proven that comics cause juvenile delinquency. You've just proven that some juvenile delinquents read comics.
Nice to see there was some pushback happening, at least.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so comics would be banned, and there are these stories in this book of, like, you know, the kids who, like, really got on board with this, who I don't know if they like the power or what, but they'd go around town and be like, we're going to ban all of our comics because they're bad. And then there's, like, all these kids with their little red wagons full of, because they weren't going out and buying more comics to burn them. They were getting their collections, bringing them to the school or wherever, and, like, setting them on fire. There's one of these anecdotes has a child lighting, he's like, first they give a solemn vow that they'll never read comics again, and then the kid who's leading all of this sets a match to a Superman comic and says, then let us commit them. And it's so creepy.
It's creepy, and it's super fascist. I mean, this is what, like, I'm not going to do Godwin's Law, I'm just comparing this in terms of fascism. Like, this is what the Hitler Youth did, you know? And I imagine that so much of this is, A, you get the kids that early because it's the kind of brainwashing, but B, like, this is now incredible peer pressure. Because now if it's, you're going to get beaten up after school if you still have comic books, like, that's what pushes people. So yeah.
Well, there are stories, too, of kids, you know, crying as they put their comics on the bonfire because they didn't want to, but they didn't see how they could not do it, or hiding their comics away, like, in a secret place so that they wouldn't, you know, they'd give up the ones they didn't like as much, but they had to save some of them. Like, yeah, it's messed up.
Here, I think, becomes a really interesting question, because let's ask, you know, how many kids, like, wind up acting out of, you know, like, emotional traumas and terrible things that have happened to them because of comic books? And how many kids wind up becoming juvenile delinquents, or whatever you want to call it, and acting out because of the emotional trauma of having to burn their comic books and their friends forcing them to burn their comic books when they're 11? Like, you want to talk about destroying the innocent, it's probably this does much more damage.
You're reminding me of, did you ever read Harriet the Spy?
Oh yeah, I loved that book.
So, you know, like, she's got her notebook that she writes in all the time, and then her friends find the notebook, and she has written some very unfavorable things, and so they get mad at her, and they start bullying her, so she starts acting out because she's being bullied, and her parents are like, she's always writing in that notebook, probably the notebook is the problem, something happened at school with the notebook, we'll take the notebook away, and her behavior gets much worse.
Right.
Because, as we keep saying, correlation is not causation.
Yeah. So clearly the comic books industry is in real trouble. So what does it do? How do we get to the CCA from here?
So, again, you know, they had the blueprint of the movie industry to follow here. And essentially what they did was the Comics Magazine Association of America got together and formed the Comics Code Authority. They laid out what was called the Comics Code, which basically said you could publish stuff that it said if you do any of these things, if you include any of this objectionable material in your comics, we will not put the seal of the Comics Code Authority on your comics. So you could still publish it. You could absolutely still, you could put whatever you want in your comic and you could publish it, but the Comics Code would not actually stamp the comic with the seal. And if the comic was not stamped with the seal, many, many, many distributors would not carry it. It depended on the comic a little bit because some publishers like Dell, or like Classics Illustrated never used it, but Dell published like the Disney comics at the time, so nobody was like, oh no, this Uncle Scrooge comic is going to be too sexy and violent. Although there actually is a very famous Uncle Scrooge story that did get censored by the publisher because it was too sexy and violent.
One thing I hadn't realized is that this is later in the 50s is when you start to see the beginning of the Harry Crumb and the Felix the Cat and stuff like that, which is very sexual and that was very much intended to be we're not going to be CCA approved.
Oh yeah,
you get a bit of like this sort of subculture which does exactly what they're trying to stop, because now the subculture, as always happens with censorship, is like, you don't want sex, you don't want violence, take this, you know?
Yeah. This directly led to the creation of underground comics because they had to be underground because they couldn't, I mean, they could get published the way they were, but they couldn't get distributed on like newsstands and stuff, which at the time, you know, there weren't comic book stores. You went down to the corner store and you got a Coke and a Twinkie and the latest issue of Captain America or whatever.
So, just to give people an idea, I want us to read through. I'm going to post a link to the full CCA. I'll probably even post a picture in the notes. But if you have it open as well, Jess, let's just read a couple of these if you want to switch back and forth.
Sure.
Just kind of grab some of your favorites. So these are the things that it says, like, you can't violate any of these if you want to have the seal. So it starts, comics shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals.
If crime is depicted, it shall be as a sordid and unpleasant activity.
Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. So the comic book, they would hate Colin Kaepernick. Like, this is like any kind of attempt to critique police is just completely out.
Yeah, well, and it's certainly not like the police were abusing any groups, and especially not black people, in the 1950s.
Yeah. You know what I love realizing this? The song Officer Krupke, from one of the most wholesome musicals ever written, would not pass this code.
Oh, no. Oh, I mean, it's wholesome now. That West Side Story was a little scandalous when it came out.
Yeah, no, that's true.
That was Sondheim feeling his oats for the first time.
Interracial romance. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal be punished for his misdeeds. All
right, I'm skipping one, but this one is really targeted. No comic magazine shall use the words horror or terror in its title. And so Bill Gaines, who was the head of EC Comics, was like, I mean, that's just targeted at us. And the other members of the comics, whatever, the Comics Magazine Association of America were like, no. And he was like, our best-selling comics are crime comics or horror comics and terror comics. There was also a rule about like how big the word crime could be on the cover, like literally how many inches it could be. Like basically this banned all of their bestsellers without actually admitting that it was banning all of their bestsellers. Mm-hmm. But if you're Archie, or your picture stories from the Bible, or your Dell, or, any of the other, publishers who specialize in funny animal comics, or westerns, or illustrated versions of classic literature, you love all this because it's going to put your biggest competitors out of business, and you don't have to change a damn thing about your content.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. And I mean, in fact, that's, that's often what happens with censorship, is that the people often, they're kind of happy to help the censorship along, or the people who are going to benefit most from it. There's a couple more here about like no nudity, no excessive violence, things like that. These are all ones that, kind of make a little more sense. They seem pretty terrible in this kind of way. But there's one in particular that I don't want to ever support the Comics Code of America, but I kind of wish they'd bring this one back. Females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, did that actually happen? I mean, did you actually stop having the, women with ridiculously proportioned breasts and always fighting crime in 6-inch heels for a while, or did it just that part of it get overlooked for a bit?
I wouldn't say that we actually had female characters with ridiculously disproportionate breasts and 6-inch heels when this came into effect. Like, what they're talking about is like the Phantom Lady cover that I sent you.
Right.
They are not talking about the really extreme, contorted, like just terrible anatomy and exploitative costumes. Like, yeah, we talked a bit at the front of the episode about like how sexy some of these covers could get. But the difference, honestly, I'm gonna be real mean right now. The difference from that era of comics and our current era of comics is that most artists at this time that we're discussing had some kind of traditional training. They had studied how to draw the human form. They knew anatomy because that was how you became an artist. And so they might draw a very sexy woman, but she would still look like she had internal organs because they knew how to draw from life. They were drawing from life. Whereas a huge percentage of comic book artists working today learned how to draw from comic books. And especially now, they learned how to draw from comic books in the early 90s, which are not the height of realism in terms of physique. And so there is a huge difference between drawing an exaggerated figure based on life and your own knowledge of anatomy and drawing an exaggerated figure based on an exaggerated figure.
Right.
And that's when those proportions really, really, really break down. And the sort of, you lose that, basically some artists lose touch with reality entirely, and they're like, that's what women look like. I'm drawing her normally. And you're like, it's just a page full of buttocks in a thong. And then also I can see her breasts somehow? How is this working?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And it's just one of those lines there where you're like, why it's coming out from a very salacious, very like censorship place, but wouldn't be terrible if comic books still adopted that rule today. Also, quick aside, when you said like, forgive you, but you were about to be quite mean, I thought you were going to go a lot meaner, because I thought what you were about to say is that the artists at this point, that there was more likely that they had reference of what a female body might look like. But, I think that's glad we're not going quite that insulting. But
artists today, they have the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no excuse. You can literally just Google life drawing models and you can practice your anatomy. Take that as cleanly or not as you like. Can I read one more from this? Because
no, please,
I
go
think
ahead.
It's my favorite. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited.
Now,
I love it.
This is great in general, but I think there's a very particular werewolf story you want to tell here.
Is there a werewolf story? Oh, yes! It's like, what? So a couple decades later, this clause against werewolfism in comics became a problem when a writer named Marv Wolfman started working for, I think it was originally, this happened with a Marvel comic, and the CCA saw the word Wolfman on the page and was like, you can't have this. And they were like, no, it's his name. There's no man who turns into a wolf. That's just his name.
Yeah, and that's hysterical, but I think there's also some great stories about times where stories got shut down that don't even seem to break the code. They're just pushing issues that are uncomfortable for white middle America to talk about, like racism. You want to tell the story of Judgment Day and what happens there?
Sure. So Judgment Day was published by EC Comics in Incredible Science Fiction number 33, which was published in 1956. So at this point, the code had been in place for 2 years. EC they had canceled a lot of their books because they had to. Like, you'll see that you'll note that the title of this is Incredible Science Fiction and not Crime and Horror That Stabs You in the Dark.
Right.
Which that's copyrighted. Don't steal that. That's my comic that I'm going to publish.
There you go.
So it was a short story. It was not the whole comic, written by Al Feldstein and drawn by Joe Orlando. And in it, it's set in the future, and an astronaut who is wearing a spacesuit the whole time, so we can't see his face, but it's implied that he's human, arrives on a planet to see if they are basically enlightened enough to join the Galactic Republic, which is the UN of planets, essentially. Right. And this planet is populated entirely by robots. And there are 2 kinds of robots, orange robots and blue robots. And the astronaut notices very quickly that blue robots are treated differently, that they are forced to live in what is functionally a ghetto called Blue Town. And their education isn't as good. They're deprived of a good education, and then they can't get good jobs, and then they don't make enough money to survive and eat cogs or whatever the robots are doing. And, like, they're treated as second-class citizens, and the orange robot talks a lot about how you have to keep them in their place, and, those people, it's deeply, deeply, deeply unsubtle. Yeah. Even before we get to the end, it's not a subtle story.
Right.
So, at the end, the astronaut says to the orange robot who's been giving him the tour, listen, you guys cannot join the Galactic Republic. You are not ready. Your planet is messed up, and you're not enlightened enough to be part of the, interplanetary community. And the orange robot is like, what do you mean? Why not? And the astronaut is like, I think you need to do a lot of soul searching to figure out why not. Mm-hmm. And he gets back into his spaceship and he flies away. And as he does, he takes off his helmet, and we see for the first time that he's a black man. Right. Which, again, this story is not subtle. It's not subtle before that last page, but that last page really drives it home. And it's a very well told and beautifully illustrated story. And that panel, that panel still delivers a punch. Like, it's a very good story.
And the whole thing is available online, so I'll also post a link to that.
So they submitted it for approval to the CCA, and the head of the CCA, this guy named Murphy, what is his first name? I don't know, who cares? He sucks. Charles Murphy. Murphy was like, you can't publish this. And they were like, what do you mean we can't publish this? And he was like, you have to change it. The astronaut has to be white. And Feldstein, the writer, was like, what? That's the whole point of the story. No, I'm not going to make him white. Like, that's the whole point. And Murphy kept insisting, and finally Bill Gaines, again, the head of EC, and Feldstein get on the phone with him. And they're, like, from all accounts, they were just cursing him out. They were like, fuck you, we're not changing the story. We didn't break any rules of the Comics Code. And if you look at the 1954 guidelines, there's absolutely nothing in there that says you can't point out racism or astronauts can't be black. Like, I don't know what his argument was.
I was going to ask, so what year was this? Was this
56?
Okay, so this is when, like, the civil rights movement has started in earnest at this point. And so I'm guessing that's kind of the rationale, is some nonsense about, like, you're making a political point and comics shouldn't do that, or you're pointing out problems with America and comics shouldn't, like, infect our young people. Like, I'm guessing it was something along those lines, or do we just have literally no idea?
I mean, I think it was just, this makes me uncomfortable, and I don't like it. I mean, as I saw somebody talking about this story, and forgive me, I can't remember where I saw this, but they basically pointed out, like, at the time, Jim Crow laws were still completely on the books in the South, and of course, all of the non-legislated but still very present bigotry was also happening in the North. And what the story essentially says is that the United States is not enlightened enough to be part of a global community.
Right.
Like, it's a it's a call-out post. It is really calling our own society out onto the carpet. Again, that's the whole point.
So, this is a real case of like censorship and how problematic this whole thing was, and this whole idea of like basically like you have to hold the status quo, and you have to never ever do things that question it. But there's a part of me that also loves the fact that the CCA was saying if you change the fact that the astronaut is black, you can still publish this, which is like one thing I hear a lot is that part of the appeal for a lot of people of science fiction and horror and other kind of like dystopian or futuristic stories is that they're often a way to hide social justice messages or social critique in ways that censors won't necessarily see, or that doesn't seem as obvious, you know. And this goes all the way back to the 1800s and like Gulliver's Travels being very critical of the British government at the time, but told in this way that they couldn't quite nail him on censorship. And what I love is we get exact proof of that, because if you just tell this metaphor that is very, very clearly an attack on American racism, but never exactly says that, the CCA would have been fine with it. But it's only once you actually make them black and directly connect it to American racism that then they have a problem.
Yeah. Well, and it's sort of, that's sort of the trick, right? Like a lot of, like you were saying, a lot of people are drawn to science fiction and speculative fiction because you can do this sort of storytelling and metaphor, which is sort of the central conceit of X-Men, but it's also the central problem of X-Men, which is often largely, look how hard things are for these marginalized, beautiful white people.
Right.
And so, you know, on the one hand, the speculative genres give scope to that and give you ways to get around that censorship. And like, God knows if Lee and Kirby had tried to have characters of color, let alone, you know, queer characters, which is the other major metaphor that the X-Men have been linked to in their original concept of the characters, that would not have flown. But at the same time, like I think now we're at a point where we have to really question when the metaphor is useful and when the metaphor is just a way to do exactly what Murphy wanted to do, which is tell a story that makes us feel good about how enlightened we are without actually looking closely at the problems that we are illuminating.
Yeah. And I think that's actually a great question that we should wrestle with when we start to get comics like X-Men that are trying to be very deliberately, as well as like when we start to get some of the first black superheroes, but they're also straight out of blaxploitation. So yeah, that's definitely going to be a topic that we touch on. What in terms of getting back to the CCA itself, though, is there any other kind of important things we want to talk about in terms of the code itself?
Well, the thing that has just sort of always struck me about it, and this we've kind of touched on this, but you know, it's one thing to say things can't be too violent, they can't be too scary, they can't be too sexy, they can't be too anarchic or nihilistic, or, you know, they have to have a moral. Like, I don't necessarily agree with all those things, but I understand where that comes from, and they don't horrify me in a bone deep way, but what is underpinning so much of this is, like you pointed out with the references to the police, you can't disrespect the police. Yeah. Like, before this happened, there were a lot of, like, lovably oafish, I mean, this is also an ethnic stereotype, but lovably oafish Irish cops in the comics, and they disappeared. Like, they could still have an Irish accent, you'll see this on the Adam West show, but they couldn't be fools the way they had been previously. You can't disrespect authority of any kind. Yeah. There was this weird thing where, like, they wouldn't draw the president, which is, like, almost approaching a weird religiosity, and, like, we can't have graven images of the president. Like, okay.
That's hilarious to me.
Yeah, until they had Superman Meet JFK, if I'm remembering this correctly, the issue came out, was written and drawn and everything before, but came out, I believe, like a month after JFK was killed.
Okay.
Which is just crazy timing. But yeah, like there's this element of thought police to the comics code. There's this element of stamping out questioning and difference that is really creepy and suffocating.
And I think suffocating is the perfect word, because I think one thing we've seen throughout history is this strategy never ever works, and it pretty much always backfires. It's pretty clear by now that often one of the best ways to get people to respect authority is to tell a story about how not all authority is perfect, and that there are problems, but that the good people will keep fighting to like weed out the bad cops, and all that kind of model. And unfortunately that can be very good propaganda. Like that can really help convince people like, oh no, it's just a few bad apples. There's not an overarching problem here. But
I like Brooklyn Nine-Nine too.
Yeah, which is hard for me to accept because I love that show so much, but that's a whole other story, but I know where you're coming from there. But when you say to someone like, you can never ever have a story about a crooked cop, and then a person experiences just one crooked cop, even if it's 1 out of 100 million, now all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, my reality doesn't match up to what I've always been told. I need to question this more, and I certainly don't think that the CCA causes the 60s, but the atmosphere in American culture that leads to things like the CCA, that leads to things like McCarthyism, that leads to things like this just suffocating conformity at all costs, absolutely leads to the 60s. And so it's interesting seeing the way that comic books and superheroes like play a small part in that.
I mean, Hodgson in the 10-cent plate kind of argues that the Comics Code Authority did lead to the 60s, because that quote that I read before is immediately followed by Page 1 news as it occurred. The story of the comics controversy is a largely forgotten chapter in the history of the culture wars, and one that defies now common notions about the evolution of 20th century popular culture, including the conception of the post-war sensibility, a raucous and cynical one, inured to violence and absorbed with sex, skeptical of authority and frozen in young adulthood, as something spawned by rock and roll. The truth is more complex. Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry added the soundtrack to a scene created in comic books.
That's fascinating. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can at
least. It's a good book.
Yeah, I definitely want to. I read a couple summaries of it and reviews of it for this, and I definitely now want to read the whole thing. So the last kind of thing I wanted to really touch on with this, and then we'll just touch on a couple of things outside the CCA before we close, because I know we've already gone quite a while. What happens to our characters during this time? I know from some of my own research and stuff that, and as you've mentioned, Wonder Woman gets a lot less sexy. There's a lot less tying people up, and not quite so much of the very sapphic imagery on Themyscira. Or Paradise Island, I guess it's called. What happens to some of our other characters in terms of how are they changed to more meet this, either the CCA itself or just this general atmosphere?
Yeah, I mean, overall, everybody gets less sexy.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody gets their, stilted in, shoehorned heterosexual love interest, like I mentioned. And I say everyone. I don't want to, roll everything up into the same umbrella, but that's not a saying that anybody's ever said, but I've coined it now. It doesn't apply to everybody, but you do start to see characters like Batwoman and Batgirl coming in as mandatory love interests, whereas somebody like Catwoman, who was, Catwoman, she wasn't even that sexy. She was glamorous, but that was the problem. She was a criminal and she was glamorous, and crime was supposed to be sordid.
Right.
So she disappeared for a decade. She just was not in the comics because
interesting.
You couldn't have a beautiful thief who was having a good time, who Batman kept letting get away on purpose because he was hot for her, which is absolutely what happened all throughout the 40s.
Well, like, what happens to someone like the Joker then, or who very clearly is having a great time as a criminal and doing so in ways that are, at least in the tales that I've seen, but and I think from some of the early ones, pretty hilarious and pretty fun. Does the Batman Rogues Gallery in general get toned down and be less funny and less entertaining?
No, it's just they all go to jail at the end. And, like, there was no Arkham at this point. So, you know, the Joker could break out of jail and have a grand old time at the playing card factory, but he's going to end up in jail at the end because he has to be punished.
Right.
And he was also, like, drawn as leering and hideous, which, I mean, that's another sort of subtle aspect to this. But the comics under the code have a very strict rule that good is beautiful and evil is ugly, which is considering the, you know, white supremacist and fat-phobic beauty standards of our society. Mm-hmm. It's got some real problematic undertones to it. Yep. With Superman, we really start to see him. I mean, at this point, nobody is a vigilante anymore. Right. By which I mean nobody is unauthorized. Everybody is duly deputized by whatever municipality they fight in. So Batman and Robin are working with Commissioner Gordon. Superman is, you know, officially deputized by, I think, everybody on the planet. So Superman, when he first appeared, was very much a figure of, I wouldn't say he was, like, actively chaotic. He's not Bugs Bunny, but there is an element of chaos. There's an element of uncontrollable madcap glee and a lot of, like, smashing his way into places and just causing a ruckus.
Yeah, I mean, that cover of the first Action Comics, you don't really know that he's a hero. You see a whole bunch of people, like, running in terror from this crazy guy holding up a car, you know?
Yeah, and he very much fought for the underdog. In the very first issue, in his first appearance, like, he beats up a wife beater. There's stories where he's fighting corrupt politicians all the time.
Right.
That certainly couldn't happen anymore. He becomes sort of the face of the patriarchy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
He becomes this very sort of staid authority figure who, so you had a couple of problems with Superman at this point in time, which fed into each other. One was that because stories couldn't be too violent or too scary or too anything, he was never facing off against anything that was really any kind of a threat. Yeah. And the other is that as time went on, he became more and more powerful to the point where, like, when he first appeared, he couldn't fly. Mm-hmm. And as we move deeper into the 50s, he can juggle planets without raising sweat. So when you have a character who is too strong for any threat, and you can't really even put in threats that are that threatening, what do? Well, you come up with reasons for him to act in ways that are just weird, and you put that on the cover, and then the reader wants to read the comic to find out what's going on. Like, there's a famous comic from around this era where, like, Superman has a lion head, and it's like, why does he have a lion head? I don't know, I guess I'll read this comic. Or, like, there's a lot of covers where he's being really, really mean to Jimmy Olsen or to Lois, and you're like, why would Superman ever do this? Like, there's one where he has clearly adopted Jimmy, and Jimmy gives him, like, a smoking jacket for Father's Day or something, and he's, like, burning it with his heat vision, and Jimmy is crying.
Oh, God.
Why would he do this? Guess we better read the story to find out. And then there's always some, like, oh, he did it to stop an alien invasion, or right. He did it because, unbeknownst to the character he was being really mean to, this would have compromised his secret identity or whatever. So you have stories like that. You have stories where he needs to teach Lois or Jimmy, but especially Lois, about a valuable lesson about proper behavior.
Oh, God.
So yeah, the lowest of, as we're getting into now the mid to late 50s, the lowest of this era stops being like Rosalind Russell with a gun and starts being this frustrated would-be housewife who can't get Superman to marry her and cries every issue. Oof.
Yeah, so really he's a patriarchal. He's spanking the disobedient kids and putting everyone there. I mean, it's incredibly fascist. It's incredibly fascist. Mm-hmm. Oof. Yeah.
And like, on the one hand, these comics, I mean, they are so fun to read. Like, I love Silver Age Superman comics. Because of these restrictions, they were actually really creative because they had to be, and you get the the wackiest, most outlandish stories, but at the same time, they're really restricted. So again, I've been reading a lot of Silver Age stories lately. I've been reading a lot of these Superman stories that have the Green Arrow backup stories in them. And there's a lot of stuff where, like, they'll go to an alien planet and they'll be like, this is so weird. On this planet, all of their houses are in bubbles, but it's still a suburban, like a Pleasantville-style suburban street, but the houses are in bubbles. Like, they'll, like, change one thing about the expectation of suburbia, but there's no... They can't break out of that sort of, like, underlying idea that this is what society looks like. And it hardly needs to be said, it's all white.
Right, of course. All right, well, I think next week we're going to, or not next week, but next time we're going to talk about the Silver Age and some of the new things and kind of what happens to the CCA and how comics pull themselves out of this. But is there any kind of last things? We're at 90 minutes already, so I want to start wrapping up. Is there any kind of last things from this era that we definitely want to touch on?
It's just a really interesting time because one of the things that you had asked about was, are there still effects today? Mm-hmm. And in the sense that, I mean, none of these rules that, if you look at the rules from 1954, none of them hold true anymore. Like, you can definitely put a naked vampire in your comic and the word crime on the cover, and and they can be rude to a police officer. Like, it's fine. But this era was so formative for, each comic book history is iterative. So what happens in this era happens the way that it does because of the comics code. And what happens in subsequent eras happens the way that it does because of this era. So I think it's important to try to pick out why that happens. And I wouldn't say, for example, that it's necessarily specifically because of the code that comics are still so white and so straight and so male dominated, but it's not that either because, we continually return to the characters who've been around for a really long time. And in part because of people like Murphy, we don't have black characters really that predate the 70s, with the exception of Black Panther. Right. We don't have queer characters who got to say that they were queer before the 90s. And that was specifically forbidden by the code. Right.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I kind of one last question I'd ask on that is, I know we talked about how, pre-CCA, 90% of American children were reading comics. Like, it was very, very high market saturation. And I know later you start to get into this idea of comic books are for geeks, that they're not really, maybe you read them as a very young kid, but especially if you're a teenager still reading them, it means you're very much not cool. Does any of it come out of this, of like, as the counterculture starts to get started, that there is some element of people thinking, oh, comic books are so square, they never talk about the pigs, they never talk about the problems with our society, and so that kind of like delegitimizes comic books for some kids, that leads to some of the stigmatization of it?
I think this is just me theorizing. I don't have any evidence to support this. But I think it's not exactly that, but it's related. I think it's just that the comics code reinforced the idea that comics were for kids. And as the decades go on, you do see that target audience getting older, and we'll definitely talk about it next time in our next episode in this series, because that was something that Marvel was able to really hit on, that DC is writing these goofy Superman stories for 8-year-olds, and Marvel is putting out angsty Spider-Man stories for 12-year-olds.
Right.
So that does start to shift, but because comic books were carved out as a space that had to be safe for the children, even today we see people thinking, oh, comic books are for kids, even though there are very few comic books published today that I would hand to a young child.
I'm not giving Alan Moore to a 10-year-old anytime soon.
I mean, it's getting better. There are imprints specifically for kids. They're like the DC Kids and YA imprints are doing great. Random House Graphic is all for kids, and they're wonderful. But that, that's because we went so far in the other direction of defensively saying, no, comic books are for adults. Look how many murders we can do in them.
Yeah, I think I'd agree there. And to be clear, I really enjoy the fact that there's a lot of comics that are aimed at adults, and I think you can explore a whole bunch of territory that you might not be able to with some kid stuff. But knowing the audience, I think, is important, and having that balance of stuff that is available for all ages. I love the fact that there is a what's the one that that it's basically Harley as a kind of disobedient toddler, and it's very much aimed at little kids. Oh,
DC Superhero Girls?
Yeah, I love that exists, and I love that Harley Quinn on the DC Universe, now HBO Max, exists, which is very, very much not aimed at kids, and it's good that we have both, but I think it's going to be an interesting story to continue to chronicle of, what are the ages these are being aimed at, and how is that responded to. So
yeah, absolutely. The other thing, real quick, that I just thought of about comics sort of falling a little bit out of the massive popularity they enjoyed is television. Like I said, at the beginning of this era, very few households in America had a television. By the end of it, many households did. And when you get into the 60s, and television starts to be a little bit more differentiated, and there are shows for different demographics, you don't have to pay for that. Mom and dad pay for that. You might as well save your dime and get something else.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. All right, well, Jess, thank you again. Your historical knowledge here is so awesome, and I appreciate the research you do and helping us learn so much about this. To our fans, what do you think? What is this all new information, or do you have other theories or ideas about where this is happening? What's your take on the CCA era of comic book history and what it means for us today? You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, email. All that information you can find by going to strandedpanda.com and then clicking on the Superhero Ethics link. That'll take you to our page, give you everything you want to know. It's also just Superhero Ethics on either Facebook or Twitter. On that page also, you can find information about some of the other great podcasts that are part of the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. Right now, we're doing some really interesting content on shows like The Boys, and I'm not part of this, but Lovecraft Country, both of which are really pushing the bounds of what The Boys is based on comic books. Lovecraft Country is obviously based on the horror writings of H.P. Lovecraft. Both of them really pushing the grounds of what does it mean to really dive into issues of race and sexism and power and money and justice and all these kind of things. The Comic Book Authority would not have had any love for either of those two works of fiction. So check those out. Check out all the other great things. You can check out some of Jessica's writings. We'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great day.